welcome to this discussion and virtual book lounge for Children Crossing Borders, a book edited by Alejandra J Josiowicz and Irasema Coronado and published at the University of Arizona Press. To discuss this very timely and important book, we are happy to welcome today three authors of the book. First, Irasema Coronado is a professor and director of the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University, where her research focuses on the politics of the US-Mexico border region and more precisely on binational cooperation, activism, human rights, environmental issues, and the role of women in politics. In addition to co-editing the volume, Dr. Coronado authors the chapter U.S. Citizen Children of Deportees in Mexico and the United States, So Close and Yet So Far. She is joined today by Kathleen Tacelosky, who is a professor of Spanish at Lebanon Valley College, Pennsylvania. Her work regarding the linguistic and educational realities of the children of returned migrants in Mexico is the topic of numerous publication and presentation, as well as TEDx talk. Her ongoing work has been supported by 2 Fulbright grants, and she authors the chapter Children of Returned Migrants Crossing the Linguistic and Cultural Border in the Mexico-United States Context. And lastly, we are happy to welcome Lina M. Caswell, who holds an MA in Sociology and Social Justice from Kean University. For the past 20 years, she served in Connecticut as an advocate for minoritized immigrant children and families and low-income Latinx communities for various organizations. She is also adjunct professor of sociology at several community colleges in New Jersey, where she also serves as a child advocate for unaccompanied immigrant children. She co-authors the chapter Unaccompanied Undocumented Immigrant Children and the Structural and Legal Violence of the U.S. Immigration System, a view from the child advocate with Emily Juez Navarro. So thank you all for being with us today. It is a pleasure to welcome you virtually to this discussion. And to start this discussion off, I will first turn to Dr. Coronado. Since 2014, we have seen an increase in unaccompanied minors along the US-Mexico border, but not necessarily an increase in our understanding of how minors experience this specific border, which your book seeks to remedy. Could you tell us a bit more about how this project came to be, what were the aims of the book, and give us a bit more of an insight into what each of the 3 sections of the book tackle?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup to Université de Québec à Montréal for hosting us and for providing this opportunity. I'm very happy because this is the first time I see Lina and I see Kathleen virtually. We've done this project through email for years. I mean, it's taken us a while to get this done. So I'm very happy. And I want to thank you, Andrian, for being so thoughtful and for being so, interested in our work and for sharing it with this broader audience. So this book is really Alejandra's idea. Alejandra thought of the book. She invited me to contribute a chapter. And then as things unfolded, she's like, can you help me co-edit this, right? So that's how this got started. But one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that this book provided a toolbox for those who work with children on the border, because there are many non-governmental organizations, many government officials, many activists, many human rights groups that deal with children. And we wanted them to have some ideas, some best practices as to how to deal with children, especially unaccompanied minors at borders. We also wanted to examine how the media, literature, children's literature, legislation, public policies, and everyday practices construct and deconstruct migrant childhoods. And we also wanted to help educators, social workers, policymakers, and advocates who accompany immigrant children in their journeys of self-recognition, their search for empowerment, and their struggles for rights and citizenship. I mean, one of the things we argue in the introduction is that we want for these children to have agency over their lives. And so it was just really a work of love. And the theoretical background that we used was basically intersectionality and decolonialism. And we basically contend that the identities of immigrant and refugee children go beyond dichotomatic hierarchical conceptions. They juxtapose questions of race, gender, class, citizenship, and geopolitics. So we were very fortunate that we had a great team. Our contributors were all from different universities, from different walks of life. And one of the things that we write in the book in the introduction is that if our book could speak, one could say that our book has a variety of accents, because we have people from Europe, we have people from Latin America, people from the US, people from Canada, and it was just a great opportunity to bring people together. And it was just a very exciting opportunity. So part one of the book deals with educational experiences on the borders. Kathleen has a chapter, and I will let Kathleen talk about her chapter. The second chapter is from a school teacher in Louisiana who's working with English language learners in the South, which is a new destination for unaccompanied minors. And then the third chapter deals with mobility, racism, and cultural borders. And that chapter is by Marta Rodriguez Cruz. And Marta looks at immigrant and returned children from the United States in the schools of Oaxaca. So that was part one, educational experiences on the border. Part two looked at children on the border in literature, art, and culture. And the first chapter in that section is by Alejandra, and she looks at the civil rights pedagogy on children on the borders, the church to belong in Latin American and Latinx children's and young adult literature. So she looks at representation in books of children. The second one is by Elizabeth Vallée and Nancy Bouchard from Montreal in Quebec. And they have a chapter on the border as a pedagogical object in an integrative and multidisciplinary learning approach, which was a school-based activity that, lent itself to then writing this chapter. And then the third one is by Valentina. And Valentina did research in Nogales, Sonora. And she worked in a government-sponsored shelter looking at young border crossers' experiences. And they had an art project to help them depict their challenges with this migration and being returned and being deported and what the future brought for them. And part three basically deals with the principle of the best interest of the child. The first one is by Patricia Nabuco Martuccelli. She wrote a book on family reunification in childhoods. Is Brazil guaranteeing the best interest of refugee children? And then I have a chapter on unaccompanied, undocumented immigrant children and the structural and legal violence of the I'm sorry, that's Lina's chapter. I'm sorry, Lina. And Lina can talk about her chapter. And my chapter is U.S. citizen children of deportees in Mexico and in the U.S., so close and yet so far. And then the last one deals with children from Bolivia working in Argentina in garment workshops, vegetable farms, stores, and domestic work. So that's really the three parts of the book. But thank you so much, Adriana, again, for inviting us to be a part of this.
Thank you. And as I read the book, I can say that all three parts are very interesting, and each chapter, as you said, bring their specific voices to the conversation, which was really interesting. So to delve more into that, I'm going to ask you all one question that will allow to explain more about what you're looking at in your specific chapters. So maybe to start, I will turn to Dr. Tacelosky. Your chapter opens the first section of the book on educational experiences of border. Your focus more specifically is on transnational students, which are children that have been schooled in both the US and Mexico. What are the specific dynamics of this particular group of students? What challenges do they face in terms of linguistics?
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, for the question, but even more importantly for inviting us today. It's such an honor to be with you and the co-authors of this great book. And also thank you to Irasema and Alejandra for the invitation to be part of it. And it is indeed a privilege and a pleasure to be part of this group and this book project. And I just wanted to start by saying that I think that a lot of times when people think about migration between the US and Mexico, the first thing that comes into mind, at least those living in the US perhaps, are the Mexicans coming to the United States. And indeed, we have a large immigrant population and second and third generation population of Mexicans in the United States. And a good deal of research, linguistic and otherwise, has been done on that population. But my research takes up the issue of the going back or the return migration, which just in its very most basic definition are migrants who return to their place of origin. And I use the word return migration a little bit in quotes because the people that I work with are children and youth who may or may not actually be returning, because it's possible that they've never been to Mexico. They perhaps were born in the US and are going to Mexico for the first time when I encounter them. My research is based in Mexico, but so we shift our thinking a little from south to north, to north to south. And I'll tell you about the trajectories of the students so you get a little bit of an idea of what I found in my work. Some of the students, in fact, the majority of students in my work are what we would call second generation immigrants born in the US. And for the purposes of this study, I'll talk about their schooling experience and especially linguistically. So first schooling in the US. Now, I will also state that their first language at home is by and large, almost 100% Spanish. When I say first language, the language of their home parents, cradle, birth, and beginnings of life, and then go to school and encounter English, usually for the first time. And then their second schooling takes them to Mexico when their parents return. And return migration is an issue studied all on its own. Of course, very interesting why people return. And some of my co-authors take up that issue and have just been mentioned as far as deportation and the like. But people go back for a variety of reasons. It's not all deportation. Some people have family matters and other issues. So the majority, as I say, the majority of students were in this trajectory one. And then some are born in Mexico. Their first schooling is in Mexico. Their second schooling is in the US. And then I meet them in Mexico after they've made that and a circular move and they're back in Mexico. And then others what are commonly called now in the literature the 1.5 generation, Mexican born, first schooling in Mexico. Mexican born but taken to the US at a very young age, so first schooling in the US. And then go back to Mexico and where I've met them. So I've met all of the participants in my study in Mexico. And then finally, there are those who go full circle and they born in the US, they go to school in the US, they go to Mexico, I meet them there. And then because we're able to keep in touch through social media and such, I find out that they have made their way back. They've been working on this project for over a decade. So I've seen some make their way back to the US. But my work is in Mexico in the schools. And what I've been interested in finding is how do they handle that linguistic? Imagine with me, if you will, your first 4, 5, 6 years of schooling are in English in the US, and then move to Mexico and find yourself in a monolingual situation where Spanish is the language of education. The people speak Spanish. I said that they have Spanish as their home language, but it's not the same thing to have Spanish at the home as it is to have Spanish in school. You know, the first 4, 5, 6 years of schooling are an exercise in linguistic development for all students. So all of that building of a school-based, text-based language happens for those students in English. Then they go to school, plunk down in Mexico, and they can talk in Spanish, but for the most part, some not even that, but I'm telling you in broad brushstrokes what I found. But they don't have that academic experience, so they open a book to read or open a computer to read academic level work at grade level, and they're not able to do so in a way that they would define as successful. So that's a big feature. Then there's the Spanish of the playground and the rest of the community, which may or may not be similar to what the Spanish the thief brought with them. Remember, the Spanish in the US is different from the Spanish in Mexico. It's a contact variety with a host of features that may or may not be similar to what they're finding in Mexico, I would contend are not. So then the other linguistic feature is English. Part of who they are speaks English. And that gets whittled down to maybe social media, contacts with friends and family in the US or possibly locally, and an hour, from 20 minutes to an hour a week of English class. So their linguistic journey shifts considerably. And I'll leave it there and encourage people to read the book for the detail.
Thank you. I found this dynamic very interesting of the different level of Spanish and how one place has different linguistics associated with it. So if we shift to Mrs. Caswell, your chapter, which you co-authored with Dr. Juez Navarro, is within the third section of the book. So we're going to skip over the second one and encourage you to grab the book to read this section. And your chapter focuses more specifically on the best interest of the child and presents it in the perspective of advocating for undocumented, unaccompanied children within the US immigration system. You present that the work of a child advocate is limited. Could you explain how so, and what could we do to help broaden it?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this invitation. And it's so wonderful to be among scholars. I am a practitioner. This is where I'm coming from. And this is the beauty of the chapter, that the voices of practitioners have been invited to have this very important discussion. And my dear colleague and friend, Emily Ruiz Navarro, is not here with us, but she is the side of the scholar in this chapter. So for all of you who are interested in this practitioner and scholar partnership, this is a great chapter to read too. So first of all, the child advocate is a particular role within the immigration system. So it was a pilot project that started in 2004, and it grew into what is now written in statute, formalized in 2013 through the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act by the American Congress. So who are the advocates, right? Just like you and me, people who want to volunteer, do the training, and want and have a calling for helping this population. And we get embedded within this long continuum of the immigration process during the detention of minors in the United States. So for people who are not familiar with that, we have apprehension of children, detention of children, and then release of children. So we advocates come into the picture with in the detention process of this continuum. And so the role of the advocate is to accompany the minor in a really big time of isolation and uncertainty in their lives, to build relationships of trust and mutual respect, and to really uncover, it's our role to uncover and contextualize the story of the minor, and to contextualize that within detention, right? And how kids choose or not choose to tell their stories. Ultimately, the story of the child is what sets them free before the law. Depending on how that story is presented, a child can receive any form of legal relief in the United States. So the goal of the child advocate is to provide best interest recommendations and to bring the minors' express wishes into the process. And these are civilians. So this is kind of a civilian response within the governmental response. Now, not every minor gets a child advocate, and that's important to know. Only the most vulnerable within unaccompanied minors get one. So the children who have experienced severe form of human trafficking, labor and sex, severe forms of abuse and neglect, persecution, members of indigenous communities, LGBTQ plus children and youth, children with developmental, physical disabilities, severe medical challenges. So we're really talking about the most vulnerable kids who can potentially receive an advocate. Not all of them gets an advocate. There's not enough of us to go around in the entire country, maybe 120 total for thousands of children. And in this role, not everybody wants to do this or has the capacity to do this. So the role is limited. And within that, the chapter really explores that within being embedded in this system, through the experience of the child advocates, we really expose the insidiousness of violence within the system of what the US calls system of care for unaccompanied minors, which is really a system of detention. Apprehension, detention, and release. And in interviewing the child advocates, we can observe how advocates feel that they not just witness this violence of the system, the legal and the structure of the system, but they also experience this violence and often felt they participate in a form of violence in the system of care. So that was just fascinating to watch from our colleagues in the interviews. So their role is very limited because their role is not mandated by the federal government. The judges don't have to consider our best interest recommendations. Detention facilities are really operating on their own, whether they want the practitioners to come in and out of the facilities. We have limited ways in which we can advocate for the children directly with the facility because it's a very delicate relationship, right? We don't want to break the bridge and then we can go into the facilities through the organization that does the work. So it's very limited role, yet it's a very important role. Now, how we saw this, through the interviews and conversations, how do we broaden this role? Like, how do we make this better, right, as practitioners, and how do we scholars continue to look into this continuum of violence? Is that, best interest recommendations should be considered mandated to be part of the immigration process for the judges to consider. No child should appear before a judge without an attorney, let alone without an advocate if an attorney is not present. In the United States, attorneys are not guaranteed constitutionally for these children. So advocates often serve as the one safeguard between the judge and the minor, but our voices are not necessarily mandated to be heard. We are in statute, but we are not followed by the money and policy, right? So, and also in the training process of advocates, after really listening to the voices of the practitioners, it's like, we really need to understand how the violence of the system affects the practitioner and how we take that violence with us. And how do we choose to reimagine and reflect our role within this system of what we call care in the United States of unaccompanied minors. And there's much more in the chapter that, we'd love to invite you to read. And I think the important part of this is that that we are bringing the voices of practitioners into this discussion, that often the voices of practitioners are muted, or maybe they're not seen in policy as important as the voices of the people who are directly affected. But we are on the ground enforcing policies that often we are enforcing against our very own communities. So it's important to hear the voices of those on the ground.
Thank you. And indeed, sometimes we feel like there's a wall between academia and the practice, whereas when we bring these two aspects together, we see there are many more links than there are impeding discussions in between the two. Dr. Coronado, your chapter also looks at the best interest of the child, but on the other side of the border, so not in the US, but more so in Mexico, focusing more specifically on the experiences of children of deportees. And you argue for the inclusion of this very principle of the best interest of the child in immigration law. Could you explain to us what is the principle of the best interest of the child, and who are the children that would be impacted by a better consideration of it within immigration law?
Well, in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child this is Article 3, and it basically says, in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. That's the principle. And I argue that basically both the United States and Mexico do not embrace this principle and do not practice it in their immigration policies. So in the United States, what is happening is that many children who are U.S. citizens find themselves in mixed status families, and sometimes the mother or the father are not legal permanent residents or are not U.S. citizens, and they're undocumented, and they get picked up by the Border Patrol and they end up in deportation proceedings and they're deported. Many families have decided that they will take their children with them. And there is a process that I describe in the book, how the Border Patrol works with families to make sure that the children have legal documents, can be transported by a family member to be reunited with the families in Mexico. So the argument is that can't judges look at the impact of that deportation of the parent and take into account that this child has been here for a long time, knows no other life, is being taken care of, and can the family be given temporary migratory protection and not deported until this is resolved? Obviously, that is not the case, and it's estimated there's about maybe 500,000 children living in Mexico because their parents have been deported, and many of them are U.S. citizens. One of the things that I advocate for in the book is that those children who are U.S. citizens that live in border cities like Tijuana, like Nogales, like Juarez, can they be provided the opportunity to attend schools in the United States? Because eventually they will return to the United States. And so isn't it better to start educating them and socializing them so that they're better equipped to deal with U.S. society rather than not having that opportunity, if that's their choice, right? And so it's very painful. Sometimes the children describe being bullied. Some of them don't speak Spanish. Some of them miss their middle school or were in high school and we're looking forward to graduation, to the football games, to the prom. And that is not something that's happening because they have been taken with their parents because of this deportation process. So it's something that I wish the US and Mexico would look at closer. I do present in the book that many of the children that were not registered at the Mexican consulate or embassy when they were born in the United States of Mexican parents don't have Mexican citizenship, and that affects them, and they cannot go to school, they cannot receive certain government services in Mexico. And trying to get their citizenship in Mexico is more complicated, more expensive, and difficult. And so I wish that the two countries would come together and find a way to provide these children with birth certificates, with an affordable process to get both citizenships, and to have the flexibility to come to the United States to school if they so desire. So it's a very complicated issue, and it's something that I found the first instance of this back in 1937 in the United States. It was a woman who was a legal permanent resident whose husband died. And when the husband died, she went to seek social services for her 5 children. And the immigration judge said, you know, we're going to have to deport you because a legal permanent resident is not eligible to solicit government services. And the judge said, you know, you can stay because he applied at the time a best interest of the child, you know, principle, if you will. So I wish that more people would embrace the best interest of the child. But the United States is not a signatory to that UN convention, and so it is a problem.
Thank you. And it's very interesting how your three chapters are also connected together if we think about deportation and learning Spanish again and how it differs. It connects back to Dr. Tacelosky's research, and then also advocating for children and seeing the child, whereas currently the immigration system sees more the national interest, whereas we should focus on who are impacted by those policies. So in addition to your theoretical and empirical contributions, what I found as a reader is very interesting about this book is the methodological aspect of the book, of how you conducted your research and how you came with those conclusions about how children cross border and how they are impacted. So I would like to ask you more questions, more specifically about how you conducted your research. So starting with Dr. Tacelosky, your research is informed, as you mentioned, by an extensive field work spanning from 2010 to 2020. And so I wanted to know, could you tell us a bit more about how you conducted this research? Working with children can be sometimes hard for the researcher, but also for other practical reasons. And also, was there anything that you found was a surprising finding over this span of 10 years?
Thank you. The work started, I was doing a different kind of research, and I was in Mexico interviewing adults regarding their crossing the border stories. And I was doing a type of linguistic discourse analysis on the narratives. That work never saw the light of day because when I was in the home of one of the families, they were telling me about their life story. And I looked at the child who was playing a video game. He looked to be about early middle school, 6th, 7th grade, something. And I turned to him and spoke to him in English and said, so you were in the US all those years and now you're here? And that was my first introduction to this population of transnational students. That was 2009. Then I applied for a grant and I got it. Not that many people were working on this question then of what are the cultural, sociological, and linguistic trajectories of these students. And now quite a few people are working on it. So it's a really exciting field that has expanded a lot. And I began then, I had some connections in Puebla, Mexico, in a southern state in Mexico, and was able to spend a year there through doing an ethnographic linguistic type of research where I, of course, interviewed the children, but also visited their schools and sometimes was privileged enough to be in their homes, talk to their other family members, teachers, school administrators, and such. That I got the contacts for those students through the schools. Then I was able to continue to go back there in the summers because I had to come back to my academic position. That was a sabbatical year. And then I've been able to go back for many summers. And then when it was time for my next sabbatical, I applied for another grant and was invited by the state of Zacatecas, a north central state of Mexico, not a border state, but not far from the border, not as far, of course, as Puebla, and was able to work there. That was a very different kind of situation because I was actually connected with the Secretaría de Educación Pública de Zacatecas and was because of the connections through them, whereas had more access to the schools. I was connected to a university when I was in Puebla, but into doing my research independently and teaching one class a semester there. So I had more access to the students through the schools, and of course, it's a different history, a different migration history, but the life experiences of the students are what I found, of course, the most interesting. And I was able to hear so many stories. And in this chapter in the book, I do have some quotes from the students that were particularly meaningful to me and to the framework of how I approached it. But I did take the interviews, so I transcribed the interviews that I did with the people, and I looked for patterns within the results, the data, the text, and found so many. And I guess if I'd have to say a surprise, it's that while each story is unique and each child has their own experience, there are definitely commonalities in the experience. And that perhaps is a bit of a surprise in that they're very different. They spent different amount of time in the US. They were brought back at different ages, but there was certainly for a lot of students a struggle, a difficulty. I found the first day of school led to particularly poignant responses when I asked students if they could tell me about their first recollections of their school experience and how they just struggled to figure out how to talk about their experiences or not to, and the interest of the other students and the teacher sometimes was a great thing, but often was a cause for concern, depending on the personality of the student, really. And then there was a lot of similarity in their experience in English class. Some found it particularly fun and interesting, and they felt sort of at home there, but others also felt very self-conscious because the level of their English was quite different from their classmates who were learning English as second language learners and not advancing nearly as fast as one does when one's completely immersed in a school like the transnational students had been. But I think I would just conclude by saying that the thing that perhaps surprised me most was the common plea on the part of these students, because I would say to them, if your teachers could know, if the administrators could know, if the decision makers in your lives could know what you went through or a message, what would you tell them? And they said, we would just like them to be patient with us and understand that we're going through a bit of a difficulty and a transition, and we would like for them to be kind to us. And so for all of this is what we should do linguistically and culturally and orientations, and I had a lot of ideas. And of course, I think that I still contend that those would be helpful, but they're looking for human kindness. And they found it, they do find it among individuals, but overall, that plea really touched me.
It is a very touching plea, and one that we often hear when you're a second language learner, of having patience. And I think that is something that we can see in the book as well in the second chapter, if I'm remembering correctly. But as they already speak Spanish, that is not something that we would think that they would ask for, whereas it makes absolute sense that they would. And Dr. Coronado, your chapter is also anchored in extensive field work with deported parents. And in your chapter, if I may quote, you highlight the need for a great deal of emotional fortitude from the researcher. And that is something that spoke to me as I read your chapter, because also doing research with a vulnerable population, that is something that takes a lot from a researcher. So I would like to ask you, what are the challenges for a researcher to conduct this type of research that you all are doing with vulnerable populations?
I think the biggest challenge for me is that you want to give them hope and you want to give them a solution, and we don't have any. And this kind of work is very labor intensive because you're asking people to share with you very complicated parts of their lives. And many times when you're conducting an interview and they'll say, you know, I was driving my son to school, the car broke down, the police came, they picked me up, I got deported. They start crying, they start sharing this. And, you know, how do you not empathize, sympathize, embrace them and tell them, you know, you understand? It's very, very powerful. I mean, likewise, when I was reading Lina's chapter, that was a very, very emotionally draining chapter, especially when someone noted that, you know, you go and the child you've been working with for weeks or months is gone. And you don't know the outcome. You don't know what happened. And the restrictions are so many that you can't follow up, right? And I think in Kathleen's case, you connect with these kids and you have their email and you have their social media. And so you're able to kind of follow them. But I think this requires a great deal of sensitivity. You have to be very appropriate. This is not a one-time answer my questions. But then there's also this sort of reciprocity, like, you know, can you ask me questions? And then they kind of feel that if I tell you my story and you tell it to others, someone will listen, someone will hear, and someone will do something about it. And, you know, we're in a country where we've been struggling with immigration reform for many, many years. And we don't see the sight. We don't see that this is a possibility. At least I don't see it as a possibility anytime soon. And it's like, what kind of hope can you give people? And that's very painful for me when you just say, you know, thank you for sharing your story. I wish you luck. I don't know when our Congress is going to act, but that's really what it needs, is an act of Congress. And so you kind of feel, I mean, I feel a little indebted to people that have been so generous with their time and with their stories that have allowed me to publish. And that's why I feel very compelled to, you know, provide opportunities for practitioners and policymakers to reflect on this and hopefully do something about it.
It is hard when we look at our research at a very local level, and then to see all that needs to be done for some effective change to take place. But at the same time, research can also inform more local initiatives that may lead to some changes in the future. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing, all of you. And before concluding, I would like to turn to Mrs. Caswell. Yours and Dr. Wes Navarro's chapters, as you mentioned, builds on your own experiences of advocating for children. And so I would like to ask you what inspired you to go into that specific field of advocacy that, as Dr. Coronado mentioned, is not an easy path, and your chapter highlights it as well. So just wanted to hear more from how you came to do this very important work.
I had to just kind of piggyback something with Dr. Coronado. It's like, it's not easy for practitioners either, right? Like we are in the trenches and we are there and we're providing that direct service. And it's wonderful to be able to say, hey, we're here, and have someone collect our voices and bring those voices to policy, right? So it's, you know, it's great to have this partnership. And in terms of how did I get to this work? Well, I'm an immigrant myself, and I came to the United States. I was 17 years old. I came by myself. I had no parents with me. So the story of these minors, I came with more and more privilege than the children I have the privilege to serve in my community. But it speaks to me because they are, you know, they're part of my community, both linguistically, culturally. And I have the pleasure to serve children from all over the world, from across the globe, from Asia, Africa, you know, from anywhere you can imagine children can arrive. I've had the privilege to serve them. So I have a personal attachment to this work. It's very intimate. It's in relation to my community, to our children. These are my kids. That's how I describe the work. This is generations that I feel often we're losing to really violent policies. And also not just the generation of youth that we're losing, but my colleagues, my practitioner colleagues are also getting lost in the shuffle, right? Our voices are not being heard. So I come from the two angles, as a member of the community and as a member of the practitioner community, and knowing that 90% of us that do this work are linguistically and culturally related to the people that we serve. So the boots on the ground, the people who are enforcing these very violent policies are often look exactly the same as the people we are enforcing these policies upon. So I think for me and for Emily is we need to bring these voices up to the table and say, yes, we need to hear the minors, we need to hear the parents, we need to hear their voices, but we also need to hear how insidious this violence is, because it's also, bringing other members of the community into this kind of blender, and we are all suffering. We're all experiencing this violence. We're all bringing this home. We're all executing things we don't want to, but sometimes we have no choice in the matter. So the topic is near and dear to my heart, is near and dear to Emily's, my colleague's heart, who was a former child advocate herself, whose work also overseas. So this mattered tremendously personally and professionally for both of us.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience in the chapter. I found it to be a very interesting and eye-opening chapter as well, to have this discussion between the two of you and the two worlds. And it is very important to highlight that it's not just the children and the parents that are impacted, but also all of those that work around them, whether they are doing research to bring those voices to the forefront, or whether they are working very deeply with them on many aspects of their life and the consequences of these immigration policies on real people, and giving them a more human views, as opposed to what the immigration system is doing and just treating them as numbers. So thank you all for joining us today and for this great discussion. I cannot urge you enough to go and get your hands on this very important book. So Children Crossing Borders, Latin American Migrant Childhood is available to order through your local libraries or through the University of Arizona Press website. It is a very important book. I am Andréane Bissonnette, and I'm a researcher at the Raoul-Dandurand chair. It was a pleasure for me to be with you all today, and I hope this discussion inspires you to read the book and learn more about this very important work that our participants today are all doing, both within and beyond academia. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Coronado, Dr. Tacelosky, and Ms. Caswell for joining us today, for your very important work and for your sharing your thoughts and your research with us in your chapters.